Hello, I'm Pat Collins. Welcome to Criminal Justice Matters. Are you a gang member? Our guests might claim you are. Did you ever leaf through the pages of Vogue or the New York Times style section thinking you're only checking out the latest fashions, but in some small way, are you keeping up with your gang? Our guest might suggest that's exactly what you were doing in writing about inner city gangs in his book, Who You Claim. Robert Garot points out that fashion, even if it's a shoelace color or a hairstyle, tells everyone around you who you are, who your friends are, and how you want to be viewed. Sounds like a Vogue reader, actually, but inner city gang life can have much more dire consequences. Who You Claim is the book from NYU Press, and our guest, author Robert Garot, is an assistant professor of sociology here at John Jay College. Robert Garot, welcome to the program, and as we get started, tell us first of all what your book's about.
Well, my book is basically about my experiences coming to know young people in an area with which I wasn't very familiar growing up, actually. It's a book about becoming involved in an alternative school and with the teachers at that school and interviewing the young people and finding out what was important to them.
When you say alternative school, alternative to what? What makes these people in need of a kind of special educational situation?
Well, basically the school that I was at was set up with a Department of Labor grant in 1990 to address high crime, high poverty areas. And this was indeed the highest crime, highest poverty area in the West Coast at the time. It was notorious, and with the police, I have some police statistics in my book. And so I really wanted to go there actually to study how young people walk away from fights and avoid violence.
We're talking about gang activity?
Well, it turned out that many of them actually were gang members. And so that ended up, without my really planning for it, becoming more or less the focus of the book.
Lots of people in the field of criminal justice have written about various aspects of gangs. In fact, I've interviewed some of them on this program. How is your work different?
Well, I think that my work is quite an alternative in many respects. First of all, I problematize, most fundamentally, the notion of gang identity. Okay, so I look at how gang identity is strategically, contextually situated, how it's a resource to be invoked to accomplish certain types of action.
What does gang identity mean, though?
Gang identity, that's a great question. How do you perform gang identity is really the problem that these young people have to face. If you are trying to represent your hood, how do you go about doing that? How do you do that in a convincing way so that you will be seen as a gang member? And I think that's a problem a lot of young people face.
Part of the gang culture, and I'm asking you more than telling you, is that they want to be insiders of some sort. They want to have a group that they can be identified with. You were studying, if not investigating these folks. You're kind of therefore the ultimate outsider. How did you gain their trust, and how did they not put on an act for you or tell you what you want to hear?
It takes time. It really takes time. I think that there weren't people that looked like me for a radius of about 5 to 10 miles around this school. We heard gunshots throughout the day. It was often strafed with helicopters. We were on the flyover zone to the local airport. Guys would come by in their Jaguars and Mercedes-Benz in the alleyway to talk with students. So it was definitely a new sort of environment. The first time I went there, it seemed like I was on the moon or something. It just wasn't the sort of place that I was used to visiting. And so as an ethnographer, that posed a challenge, and it posed a real great deal of rewards.
What's the draw, though, for students, high school kids, teenagers to get involved with a gang?
Well, in some neighborhoods, it's really all that's going on, okay? Because there's so much disenfranchisement, marginalization, and just plain old neglect. Where are the social programs? Where are the sorts of programs that people take for granted in other areas? Hockey teams, sports teams, YMCAs, all the things that kids have to do to stay out of trouble and have fun just often aren't available. So I see gangs as a very strategic and fun and way of creating a culture, of creating a way of being involved. I think needs to be acknowledged and respected in many ways for creating something out of nothing.
So you're kind of saying, let me try and put this in the right light, that all the hockey teams and the activities are kind of gang activity, although a very benevolent one in themselves. In the absence of that, there's a tendency of teenagers to just form these associations?
Well, you know, when you really look at it, you know, it's, as Sudhir Venkatesh will say, that many football teams and fraternities fit all the criminological criteria and definitions that we apply to gangs, to understand what a gang is. Others will, you know, like Luis Barrios here at John Jay will say, if you have 10 white people on a street corner, it's a hockey team. If it's 10 Latinos or black people, it's a gang. You know, so it's a real problem, I think, in the criminological literature.
How about how the criminal justice system, and I'm talking about the law enforcement community in particular, they view them as the enemy? Is that right? Does that make things worse?
I think so. I think so. I think that perhaps there are some young people who enjoy being viewed as the enemy, who perform that, but ultimately they don't reap very many rewards from it. And I think many of them very much resent it. A lot of the young people that I interviewed had been beaten multiple times, had many bones broken by the police, had been picked up and dropped off in rival neighborhoods by the police, and really didn't have a lot of love lost for police, even as many wanted to become police officers themselves.
But isn't there a level of criminal activity, though, that gets the police involved? I don't want to paint all these people as innocent. I'm going to leave the building today and walk down 58th Street, and I think the odds are very good that I will not be arrested or beat up by the cops. Yet so many of these urban youths have that experience.
Right.
Why?
Why are they getting beat up by the cops? I think that we really need to go back to the origin of the police as the body which returned escaped slaves. You know, if we look at works like Cooper's Afrocentric view of policing, and like in my crim classes, I pair that with Van Manen's view on police socialization. Now, basically, the police socialize each other generation after generation. So there's this long-term trend of police socializing other police to basically be racist. So the racism of the police, which you see in things such as the communications that the Christopher Commission found after the Rodney King beatings, you know, it was extremely racist. So that backstage conversations, then that's the way that most police officers are socialized. That's how they learn how to be police officers. It's often very, very racist.
Is gang membership something that stems from traits within individuals or traits within communities?
Well, like I said, I see being in a gang as a, you know, on the individual level, as a strategic, situated sort of performance and enactment in order to accomplish something, to impose an identity, to impose a threat, to act like someone who's cool or who's with it, that can be kind of turned on and off at will. But for a group, there's a lot more to it. You know, there's a lot involved in maintaining group cohesion and maintaining a sense of what this group is about, maintaining common rituals and symbols and clothing. That's really what human beings do when they come together in groups. I mean, my fundamental perspective on gangs is not criminological. I don't see gangs and crime as necessarily related.
But one thing that we can say, though, particularly about teenagers, is one common ground that they all have is that they are in school, or supposed to be in school. How does the educational system help them or make things worse for them? And
well,
what I want to get to there is you talk about some of the bad schools and bad teachers, that teachers consider them. You write in your book that some of the teachers consider gang members unteachable, and most of these teachers are about getting through the day more than teaching.
Right.
How common is that, and how can that change?
Well, it's awfully common. You know, I think that on the most fundamental level, we need to get back to Jonathan Kozol's book, Savage Inequalities, you know, because the way that our schools are funded through local tax initiatives leads to incredible disparities in our public education system, to say nothing of the disparities between public and private education. Bill Moyers did a great special on the Ohio schools a number of years ago. At this point, you know, with current fiscal issues, I don't think that states, and certainly not the federal government, is looking at equalizing the playing field as much as it should be.
But how do you I don't want to exactly defend those teachers, but maybe explain them in that, how do you teach people, and how do you get through to people or inspire people whose goal it is to just get over on you? Because that's got to be part of the gang mentality. How do you break through that?
Well, I think that it's always a little dubious and risky when we're making assumptions, you know, because people, any person will basically kind of mirror back to you what you bring to the table. And when you've been disrespected by your school, by your neighborhood, by your police, often by your parents, you feel like you need to find some respect. And some teachers know how to give respect. Some teachers don't. The teachers who don't know how to respect their students tend not to last very long.
You make the point that the students, therefore, who need the most attention get the least.
Well, that depends. You know, sometimes there are teachers, you know, I myself was a 5th grade teacher in the Los Angeles Unified School District for 2 years in the district intern program. I learned a lot. We were at one of the very lowest performing schools. We were taken over by the district, and I assure you that at that school there were some of the most amazing teachers I've ever met in my life. Some of the most dedicated, fantastic individuals.
Do schools attempt to do anything about discouraging gang activity? Is there any systematic or plan about it?
Because I find that the more you try to outlaw it, the more fascinating and fun it becomes for the young people to get around whatever rules are trying to be invoked. It becomes a sort of insidious cat and mouse game.
So you wouldn't, for example, be an advocate of something like dress codes in schools? Well, I know some school districts have thought they've solved the problems by taking away all the labels and all the statuses and symbols. And
students will always find a way to represent some sort of identity. And the fundamental way of doing it is not in what you wear, but it's how you wear it. And that's what I try to show in that chapter. It means the way you walk, the way you present yourself, that says a lot more about who you are and who you claim than any specific kind of color. And how can you regulate a way of presenting the self? I think that's the fundamental issue, because we see that in Ann Ferguson's book, Bad Boys, where teachers try to regulate how students comport themselves in the hallways. And that's why students get suspended so often in our zero tolerance policy. You're not standing the right way or walking the right way. And it's really just fundamentally an issue of civil liberties for students to be able to create and mold their own identity. So that's what I'm trying to really celebrate in this book, is to like look at young people and appreciate the way that they can create flowers out of cracks in the sidewalk.
Or change their shoelace color to point out who they are, I think, as you say at one point.
Well, you know, there's all kinds of different ways of getting by. And it's really marvelous when you just try to understand where they're coming from and how, you know, these are not just like adults in the making, these are full-fledged human beings, right? And so they're doing all the things that human beings have to do to actualize themselves, to be creative, to be spontaneous, to be alive. And it's just beautiful.
Part of your book talks about avoidance of gang activity and sometimes the need to fight, to get into conflicts. And you mentioned a very loaded question, the question being, where are you from?
Right.
What's that question about, and what does it cause?
Well, you know, when I was there at the setting, and you know, you hear so much about gangs, and you wonder, well, what does that actually mean? You know, where does the rubber meet the road? And that's where the rubber meets the road. That's when gang identity becomes paramount. So a young person may be a son, maybe a student, maybe a basketball player, a rapper, you know, and have all sorts of things going for them, but they also hang out with a certain group. And when they go in other neighborhoods, they may get hit up. Or if they have outsiders from other neighborhoods come into their neighborhoods, they may hit them up by demanding to know where you're from. It's not phrased as a question, it's phrased as a demand. So you have to be sort of a urban geographer, as a young person growing up in these areas, to know where the lines are, how the boundaries are changing, what you can wear, where, who to talk to. And there's some kids that keep up with it, but it's an all-consuming task, and often those are the kids that end up dropping out of school because their minds are so focused on the streets and how you negotiate those streets. It's not an easy or a simple matter.
I think I know what it means, but you used the phrase a moment ago, hitting up. What does that mean?
That means going up to a stranger and demanding, where are you from? Sometimes from behind the barrel of a gun, or with a knife, and you never know if that person has their homies behind them or what they're thinking about when you get hit up. And so you have to think about that as a possibility before you go to school. And you know, there's a great article in Social Problems called 3 Block Fathers about how there's these fathers with children and they can only take their kids within a 3-block radius. Because those boundaries are reinforced by that sort of demand. But what I try to show in the book is how you can also rank out. You can also claim to be from nowhere. So it's a device that's not limiting. It's a resource that people can invoke. So if you get hit up, maybe you say, well, I bang for God. You know, where are you from? I'm from Lutheran Church of Christ. You know, and so a lot of the guys will kind of get around the gang thing by claiming a church.
But then they can go back to the other dangerous question: what are you looking at? Right, and start in that way.
Well, I think that comes up in any neighborhood. But where are you from was interesting. I think I'm not even sure if it's as much of a New York phenomenon.
Are there phases of gang life? You know, where does it start? Does it have a certain trajectory in terms of age?
Well, I think that we need to make a real distinction between like real organized crime groups that practically have sort of a mafia-like structure, and that's not really what I'm talking about in my book. We really need to distinguish between those and between the sort of spontaneous playgroups that develop, which Thrasher studied back in the 1920s. And those groups still are very much alive and well. And that's the ways that kids, as Ralph Cintron says, make something out of nothing. But the danger is that because of that lack of other institutional outlets and programs, that ingenious creative response out of neglect can then be transformed by the adults in the more established traditional mafia-like organizations to become a very serious and dangerous threat.
In teaching gang members, in educating them, how can you educate them to cope with either the avoidance of gang life or dealing with the situation?
You got to educate them as kids. You can't come at them as gang members. That's really none of our business. You know, when a teacher would ask a student where he was from or who he was hanging with, students would get very resentful. But it's none of the teacher's business. The teachers need to focus on the subject matter.
What I mean there, though, is how can you, but how can you help students?
You need to help them the way that students anywhere are helped, by meeting them on their level, assessing them, and then teaching the curriculum.
But don't you need to give them? Don't you need to help them with strategies that they're not going to get at home, such as strategies about avoiding conflict, and can that work itself into a curriculum? I think that's very patronizing.
That's one thing I really focus on in the book a lot, is their own ways that they have developed to ingeniously walk away from fights and avoid violence. And no one has taught them that. But I guarantee you that the most violent, the most thuggish kid out there has walked away from fights much more than he's ever participated in them.
And that's viewed as an achievement, or?
What I show in the book is that there are many rationally acceptable, ecologically acceptable ways to get away with walking away from a fight. You know, so I really take issue with Elijah Anderson's notion of the code of the street. I have sort of this debate with the code of the street throughout the book, where Elijah Anderson says, hey, you can't walk away from a fight without being punked for life, really, according to the code. And I show, well, you know, here's all these kids I talk to, and these are tough kids. These are gang members. These are kids who've been in and out of prison. You know, they wouldn't be at that school if they weren't on probation or dropouts or referred for fights or drug dealing. It's a rough school. And these are kids who can tell me many times, many ways that they walked away from fights.
On this program, a number of times we talked about the ebb and flow of crime statistics. They've been up and they've been down. And some of the authors in this program and guests in this program have suggested that changes in criminal patterns are demographic, that the bad guys, and I suppose I should say women, grow up or go to jail. Where are we in terms of gang activity in that sphere? Do they age out, is my question, or is there a cycle?
I think, you know, in our society, the big difference is that in some neighborhoods, the crime can occur indoors. You know, when you have suburban, you know, single residential units, the child abuse and neglect, the domestic violence, the drug abuse, which, you know, all the studies show is equal in the inner cities and in the suburbs. It's indoors. You have the resources to keep that under lock and key, more or less, and not have it be exposed to the police. But when you're poor and you spend a lot of your time out on the street, especially in the summertime, those same activities become open to public exposure. And then due to the racism of our criminal justice system, beginning with police enforcement and profiling, those are the sorts of places where that behavior is going to be more noticed.
So getting back to education, I seem to be hearing that gang membership really cannot be avoided and that schools shouldn't mess with it at all.
Well, what do we mean by gang? You know, the gang literature has been working on this for almost 100 years now. I mean, when I was a kid, I developed this little friendship group where other friends of mine would have to jump out of a tree to be in the group. That's an initiation ceremony. And we went around and we wreaked havoc. You know, we broke things, we vandalized, you know, we ran around. We were a little gang out in the middle of the desert in California. You know, kids, like humans, they like to join groups. Why should kids who do that in certain areas be criminalized for it? I find that really tragic. And I think that we need to recognize it with outreach programs like they did in the 50s, like Suttles talks about, like Spergel talked about in the 50s, and that's the way to go. Malcolm Klein is wrong. You know, it's not that, okay, you go out, you talk with the gang members, you help them